There is a question that quietly torments every thinking mind. Why do the most powerful people in society seem immune to consequences? Why do scandals dissolve around them like smoke? Why does justice move swiftly for the weak but crawl endlessly for the elite? Today, we are not merely exposing corruption. We are solving a deeper problem, the psychological machinery that makes certain people untouchable. Because until you understand the mind of the untouchable elite, you will always mistake power for morality and dominance for virtue. The illusion of moral superiority, how power manufactures innocence. Power rarely presents itself as brute force. It prefers elegance. It dresses in tailored language, refined gestures, charitable foundations, and public smiles. It does not announce domination, it performs virtue. And through this performance, it constructs one of the most powerful psychological shields ever devised, the illusion of moral superiority. The human mind is deeply inclined to associate elevation with merit. When someone stands above the masses, wealthier, more visible, more celebrated, the instinctive assumption is that they must possess superior discipline, intelligence, or character. Success becomes retroactive proof of righteousness. The position is taken as evidence. Few pause to question whether the ladder itself was crooked. This illusion operates quietly. It does not require propaganda in its crude form. It thrives in subtle repetition. The elite are photographed at humanitarian events, quoted in thoughtful interviews, invited to speak on ethics and leadership. The spectacle is carefully curated. Each appearance becomes a psychological deposit into the account of perceived virtue. The public begins to internalize a simple equation: prominence equals legitimacy. What makes this illusion so resilient is that it satisfies a deep emotional need. People want to believe that the world is structured by fairness. To admit that power can accumulate independently of morality is to confront chaos. It suggests that effort may not guarantee reward, that integrity does not always ascend. This thought is unbearable for many, so they cling to the comforting belief that those who rise must deserve to rise. Thus, power manufactures innocence not by denying wrongdoing directly, but by surrounding itself with symbols of goodness. A foundation here, a scholarship there, a public stance on popular causes. Each gesture reinforces a narrative of moral refinement. When accusations surface, they collide not with a neutral audience, but with an audience already invested in the elite's virtue. Cognitive resistance emerges. The mind whispers, it cannot be true. The more powerful the figure, the stronger the resistance. To accept guilt would require dismantling the entire psychological structure that has been built around them. It would mean admitting that admiration was misplaced, that trust was naive. Many would rather reinterpret the evidence than endure that humiliation. There is also the intoxicating aura of inevitability. The elite often appear untouchable long before they are formally protected. Their networks are vast, their resources immense, their influence pervasive. Observers begin to sense that challenging them is futile, and from this perception arises a subtle reverence. What cannot be easily defeated begins to feel almost natural, almost ordained. In this way, power reshapes perception itself. The elite do not merely possess authority, they radiate an atmosphere of exception. Their mistakes are framed as complexities. Their aggressions are reframed as strategic necessities. Their silence is interpreted as wisdom. Language bends around them. Another psychological mechanism strengthens the illusion: aspiration. Many individuals secretly desire proximity to power. To condemn the elite too strongly would be to condemn a version of themselves they hope to become. Thus criticism softens. Judgment hesitates. The public oscillates between envy and admiration, and in that oscillation the elite remain protected. The illusion of moral superiority also feeds on comparison. Society often highlights the visible flaws of the powerless, petty crimes, public failures, impulsive mistakes, while the transgressions of the elite remain abstract, legalistic, distant. The contrast reinforces a subconscious hierarchy of worth. The powerful appear composed and dignified. The weak appear chaotic and irresponsible. The narrative writes itself. Over time, the elite may begin to internalize the illusion they have helped construct. Constant affirmation distorts self-perception. Surrounded by deference, insulated from contradiction, they come to see their desires as justified by default. Privilege transforms into perceived entitlement. The line between personal will and moral right dissolves. This is how innocence is manufactured, not through purity of action, but through control of interpretation. The elite understand, instinctively or deliberately, that perception governs consequence. If they can dominate the narrative, they can dilute accountability. If they can maintain the aura of superiority, doubt will fracture before it solidifies into outrage. And so the illusion persists, sustained by admiration, fear, aspiration, and the human hunger for order, a carefully maintained facade in which power does not appear as domination but as destiny, not as privilege but as proof of virtue, not as calculated influence but as natural superiority, until the very idea of questioning it feels almost irrational, and the structure of reverence becomes stronger than the evidence that challenges it. The architecture of untouchability, fear, dependency, and collective silence. Untouchability is not an accident of circumstance. It is a deliberate construction. It is built layer by layer, relationship by relationship, until it resembles a fortress that cannot be breached without collapse, spreading far beyond its walls. What appears from a distance as individual power is, upon closer examination, an intricate architecture of fear, dependency, and collective silence. No elite figure stands alone. Around every untouchable individual exists a network. Lawyers who interpret reality through legal language, executives whose careers depend on loyalty, media figures who benefit from access, politicians who trade favors, employees who rely on salaries, institutions that receive donations. Each connection forms a strand in a web. Alone, a strand is fragile. Together, they are nearly unbreakable. Dependency is a silent cement of this structure. When livelihoods are tied to a single source of authority, truth becomes negotiable. A subordinate who suspects wrongdoing must calculate more than morality. He must calculate survival, mortgage payments, family security, social standing. These weigh heavier in the mind than abstract justice. Conscience competes with consequence, and consequence often wins. Fear operates in subtle forms. It is not always a crude threat of violence or public humiliation. More often it is professional exile, loss of opportunity, the quiet closing of doors. The elite rarely need to issue explicit warnings. Their position speaks for them. The awareness of their reach is enough to generate self-censorship in those around them. Human beings are highly sensitive to social belonging. Exclusion can feel like annihilation. Within elite circles, loyalty becomes currency. Those who comply are rewarded with access, prestige, and protection. Those who dissent are quietly removed from the inner sphere. Observers notice this pattern and learn without instruction. Silence becomes a safer path. Collective silence does not emerge from coordinated conspiracy alone. It arises from fragmented hesitation. One individual assumes another will speak. Another believes the issue is not severe enough to justify risk. A third convinces himself that the system will correct itself. Responsibility dissolves into diffusion. No single person feels accountable, and thus the structure remains intact. Fear and dependency intertwine until they are indistinguishable. An employee dependent on income fears unemployment. A politician dependent on funding fears exposure. A journalist dependent on access fears being blacklisted. Each person rationalizes silence differently, but the outcome is the same: protection of the powerful. Over time, this network begins to resemble an ecosystem. The elite become not merely influential individuals, but central nodes. Removing them would destabilize countless relationships. The potential chaos of disruption frightens even those who privately resent them. Stability, even corrupt stability, feels preferable to uncertainty. There is also the phenomenon of gradual normalization. Minor ethical compromises, once tolerated, pave the way for larger ones. When small irregularities are ignored, they set a precedent. Silence in one instance makes silence easier in the next. The architecture thickens with every unchallenged act. Institutions contribute to this fortification. Legal complexity obscures clarity. Public relations strategies redirect attention. Bureaucratic procedures delay action until outrage cools. Each mechanism adds another layer of insulation. Accountability becomes a labyrinth rather than a direct path. The crowd, observing from a distance, senses its complexity and withdraws. The machinery appears too vast to confront. Individuals feel insignificant against the scale of influence. This perception strengthens the elite's untouchability. Power magnifies itself when resistance fragments into isolated voices. Even those who suspect the truth may hesitate because exposure threatens not only the elite but the network itself. Colleagues may lose jobs. Institutions may collapse. Investors may suffer losses. The web is designed so that consequences ripple outward, ensuring that any challenge appears reckless rather than courageous. Thus, untouchability is sustained less by invincibility and more by interdependence. It thrives where many small fears align. It solidifies when personal interest overrides collective integrity. It grows when silence becomes habitual and dissent becomes rare. Within such an architecture, the elite need not constantly assert dominance. The structure enforces itself. People anticipate expectations. They adjust behavior without direct instruction. The fortress of immunity stands not because it cannot be attacked, but because too many individuals have something to lose by attacking it, and too few are willing to bear the cost of fracture that would follow if the central pillar was struck and the carefully balanced edifice of influence, benefit, and shared vulnerability were to tremble under the weight of truth that everyone senses yet few dare to articulate openly. The will to dominate. Why elites crave immunity more than wealth. Wealth is often mistaken for the ultimate ambition of the powerful, yet wealth alone rarely satisfies those who ascend to the highest tiers of influence. Comfort can be purchased relatively early in the journey. Security can be secured long before the empire is complete. And yet the ascent continues. The acquisitions multiply. The influence expands. The appetite does not diminish. This persistence reveals something deeper than material desire, a relentless will to dominate. Domination is not merely control over resources. It is control over reality itself. It is a capacity to define narratives, to shape public perception, to determine which voices are amplified and which are silenced. For the elite, money becomes a tool, not an end. It is the instrument through which immunity is constructed, because immunity, freedom from consequence, is the purest expression of power. To dominate is to move without restraint. The ordinary individual lives within boundaries, legal limits, social judgment, financial restriction. The elite gradually transcend these constraints. They discover that rules bend when influence is efficient. Regulations soften when relationships are strategic. Public outrage dissipates when attention is redirected. Each successful evasion reinforces a powerful psychological lesson. Consequence is negotiable. This realization transforms ambition into something more dangerous. The pursuit shifts from accumulation to exemption. It is no longer enough to possess. One must be beyond accountability. Immunity becomes intoxicating because it affirms superiority. It signals that one exists above the structures that confine others. At the psychological core lies an expansive will, a force that seeks expression without limitation. When unchecked, this will grows restless in the presence of barriers. The elite, having already conquered economic thresholds, seek to conquer institutional ones. Influence over law, media, politics, and culture becomes the next horizon. Each conquest expands a territory in which their desires can operate freely. There is also a subtle transformation of identity. As power consolidates, the elite begin to perceive themselves not as participants within a system, but as architects of it. Their decisions ripple outward, shaping markets, careers, public discourse. This feedback loop breeds a sense of indispensability. If their actions influence so much they reason, then perhaps their perspective is inherently superior. From this belief emerges a quiet justification for exceptional treatment. Immunity feeds this perception. When mistakes fail to result in punishment, the mind interprets survival as validation. Consequence is replaced by rationalization. Criticism is reframed as envy. Legal challenges are dismissed as technical inconveniences. The absence of restraint distorts self-assessment. The elite no longer measure themselves against shared standards. They measure themselves against their own expanding capacity. The craving for immunity also stems from fear, not fear of poverty, but fear of vulnerability. To be accountable is to be equal, and equality threatens a hierarchy that power depends upon. If the elite was subject to the same limitations as the ordinary citizen, their elevated status would lose its mystique. Immunity preserves distance. It maintains a psychological gap that reinforces dominance. This will to dominate does not always manifest as cruelty. Often it appears as strategic calculation. Decisions are justified as necessary for growth, for stability, for vision. Yet beneath these rationalizations lies the same impulse, the expansion of personal agency at the expense of shared constraint. The elite may convince themselves that their dominance benefits society, but the true satisfaction lies in the act of expansion itself. Unchecked will naturally intensifies. Without friction, it accelerates. When obstacles vanish, desire amplifies. Immunity removes friction. It silences opposition before it matures. It absorbs dissent into controlled narratives. The elite become accustomed to movement without resistance, and resistance, when it finally emerges, feels illegitimate. There is a paradox within this dynamic. The more immunity one acquires, the more fragile one becomes internally. For without opposition, self-reflection weakens. Without accountability, limits blur. The will expands until it mistakes its own impulse for moral right. Power ceases to be a responsibility and becomes an identity. Thus, the elite crave immunity more than wealth, because wealth satisfies the body, but immunity exalts the will. Wealth comforts. Immunity liberates from restraint. Wealth purchases influence. Immunity confirms supremacy. And in the silent chambers of power, where few dare to contradict and fewer still can impose consequence, the will continues to stretch beyond boundaries, seeking not mere possession but exemption, not mere authority but transcendence of accountability, until dominance itself becomes a defining measure of existence and every structure around them bends subtly to accommodate that expanding force. The complicity of the crowd, why society protects its own oppressors. It is comforting to imagine that untouchable elites exist solely because of their cunning, their strategy, or their corruption. This explanation preserves the innocence of the many. It suggests that power is imposed from above and endured unwillingly from below. But the truth is more unsettling. The endurance of untouchable elites depends not only on their will to dominate, but on the quiet complicity of the crowd. The crowd rarely perceives itself as complicit. It believes it is powerless, fragmented, distracted. Yet power structures endure because they are tolerated. The masses may complain, criticize, even protest and control bursts, but rarely do they sustain the discipline required to dismantle entrenched authority. Outrage flickers and fades. Attention shifts. Life resumes. And the elites remain. Part of this complicity is rooted in admiration. Power fascinates. Wealth dazzles. Influence commands attention. Even those who condemn the elite often consume their narratives, follow their movements, analyze their strategies. There is a subtle reverence embedded within criticism. To be powerful is to be significant, and significance attracts fixation. In this fixation, the elite gains psychological dominance. There is also envy, though it hides beneath moral language. Many resent the privileges of the elite not because privilege exists, but because they themselves do not possess it. This resentment weakens resistance. Instead of rejecting the structure entirely, individuals imagine themselves ascending within it. They dream of becoming untouchable rather than abolishing untouchability. In this way, the system perpetuates itself through aspiration. Fear plays its role here as well, but not always direct fear of retaliation. It is often fear of instability. To confront entrenched power threatens economic systems, social networks, institutional foundations. People sense that dismantling the elite could produce chaos. Jobs may vanish. Markets may falter. Institutions may fracture. Stability, even if unjust, feels safer than uncertainty, and so the crowd chooses predictability over principle. Another mechanism of complicity lies in distraction. Modern society inundates the mind with endless stimuli, entertainment, trivial controversies, personal struggles. Sustained attention is rare. The elite understand that time erodes outrage. Delay becomes defense. Investigations stretch. Narratives grow complicated. The crowd, overwhelmed by daily concerns, moves on. Silence returns not through agreement, but through exhaustion. There is also the psychological need to believe in a just world. If the system were fundamentally corrupt, then effort might be meaningless and merit might not guarantee reward. This thought destabilizes motivation. To preserve hope, many choose to believe that injustice at the top is exaggerated or temporary. They reinterpret evidence to maintain faith in fairness. In doing so, they shield the very structures that disadvantage them. Collective responsibility dissolves into individual helplessness. Each person assumes that meaningful change requires someone else to act, a journalist, a politician, a whistleblower. When everyone waits, no one moves. The elite benefit from this diffusion of responsibility. The crowd becomes an audience rather than an actor. Social conformity further entrenches complicity. Humans are deeply attuned to group consensus. When peers remain silent, individuals hesitate to speak. When influential voices downplay wrongdoing, doubt spreads. Few are willing to risk isolation for abstract justice. The fear of standing alone is often stronger than the discomfort of silent agreement. Even moral outrage can become performative rather than transformative. Public declarations of condemnation provide emotional release without structural consequence. Expression replaces action. The crowd feels righteous without altering the conditions that sustain the elite. The system absorbs dissent and continues. Over time, this pattern creates a feedback loop. The elite grow bolder as they perceive limited resistance. The crowd grows more cynical as it perceives limited accountability. Cynicism breeds passivity. Passivity strengthens power. The cycle tightens. The most unsettling aspect of this complicity is that it is rarely conscious. It manifests in small decisions, choosing comfort over confrontation, skepticism over courage, distraction over discipline. Each choice appears insignificant, but collectively they form a shield around the powerful. Thus society protects its own oppressors not through explicit allegiance, but through inertia, admiration, envy, fear of instability, and the persistent hope that someone else will bear the burden of resistance while the majority watches from a safe distance, preserving personal security at the cost of collective integrity and reinforcing, through everyday hesitation and rationalization, the very hierarchy that quietly governs their lives.